We talked a lot about Bretton Woods in this class and the institutions that came out of Bretton Woods. So let me just clarify something on this slide. So on the right-hand side of the slide, those 3 bullet points refer to this post-World War II period, not necessarily to Bretton Woods specifically. Okay, so after World War II, we had this broad period of global integration and cooperation. The whole aim was to reduce trade barriers, and to help with that, there were a couple of trade agreements that eventually morphed into the World Trade Organization. Of course, the most well-known is GATT. The creation of the UN happened after World War II. It happened in 1945, and the UN grew out of the former League of Nations. The UN is not really a Bretton Woods institution, although it emerged around the same time. So the real Bretton Woods institutions are the World Bank and the IMF. You can argue whether or not GATT is really a Bretton Woods institution or not, kind of a precursor to the World Trade Organization. But the World Bank and IMF definitely, yes. The UN emerged around the same time, but not out of the Bretton Woods meeting, okay? So some of the other things that are associated with neoliberalism are lower taxes on the rich, with this idea that of trickle-down economics, that if you don't tax the rich, they'll open businesses and they'll create jobs and it'll all be good. We deregulated, I think I already mentioned that one. And neoliberalism did cause an increase in income inequality around the globe. So on my way to school, when we were going to school, I would walk past the national debt clock, and it reminded me of our sovereign debt. So sovereign debt is merely what a country owes its creditors. It's not the trade deficit. It doesn't have anything to do with the trade deficit, really. It's not the nation's investment funds, etc. But it's the kind of total debt that a nation owes to its various creditors, which might include the World Bank, it might include the IMF, that might include the China Development Bank, it might include other nations. It includes a lot of things. So that whole grand total is your sovereign debt. As I mentioned, once neoliberalism got going, the IMF and World Bank really embraced that and started to impose conditions on the loans that they were making to developing countries and other countries in times of need. And that came to be known as the Washington Consensus. And the Washington Consensus was this idea that we were going to take our neoliberal principles and say that this is the best way for capitalism to develop. So if you want a loan from the IMF, you need to abandon your authoritarian state-owned enterprise ways and embrace the Washington Consensus. So the Washington Consensus has been widely criticized. For one thing, it takes a one-size-fits-all approach to economic development. And we know that what works for Haiti might not work for Nigeria. It also imposes austerity measures at times when countries can least afford them. So if you think of the Greek debt crisis, just when Greece really needed social programs because people didn't have jobs, they had to go, the Washington Consensus imposed austerity measures on the country. And it may create, all of this creates higher levels of income inequality because it promotes the principles of the Washington Consensus. The international monetary system is all about the global governance of money. So the IMF forms the backdrop for global finance. It also provides financial guidance for sovereign states. So it's a system of aiding sovereign states in governing their money. And it helps keep the global financial system stable. The IMF includes governments, includes international institutions like and especially the IMF, and it helps facilitate trade and keep money flowing freely around the globe. It's significantly concerned with exchange rates and exchange rate regimes around the globe. The IMF, again, is a major player in the international monetary system. After Bretton Woods, you'll recall that the US dollar was pegged to gold, and everybody else was pegged to the US dollar. When the US abandoned the gold standard and that system kind of collapsed, the world leaders met and came up with the Jamaica Accords. And the Jamaica Accords said that it was okay for countries to float their currency if they wanted to. And we'll recall from class that about 50% of countries still have some kind of peg in their currency for various reasons. So now we basically have two systems. We have a floating rate regime where your money, the value of your currency, is determined by supply and demand. And then we have a kind of pegged system where you are pegged to someone else's currency, frequently the US dollar, but not always. Sometimes you're pegged to the euro or to a basket of currencies that might include the euro and the US dollar. Pegs can be soft or hard. So an official peg says, my currency is worth 1.5 times the US dollar. An unofficial peg might be a range that as the dollar goes up, my currency goes up, just plus or minus, that kind of thing. We can also have systems like China does, where they have a managed float system, where their currency isn't freely floating, but nor is it a hard peg either. And different systems have different pros and cons. A floating system is better if you if you have a financial crisis and you need to devalue your currency. You have much more freedom and flexibility over your currency. However, you also have a much more volatile currency, and you're at greater risk for inflation and other currency-related problems. So here's a nice slide that explains the idea behind purchasing power parity and what that implies about exchange rates. So the idea with purchasing power parity is that it measures the value of a basket of goods in one country versus the affordability of that same basket of goods in another country. So it's how much your currency can buy in your own market versus how much the US dollar can buy in its own market. And that determines an exchange rate, which then tells you if there's an implied exchange rate in that purchasing power system. The class seemed very interested in this idea of going cashless and why going cashless is a good thing in general. So one of the things that going cashless does is it's cheaper for the financial sector. And one of the reasons it's cheaper is because it reduces transaction costs. So transaction costs are otherwise known as friction. Friction are those little costs along the way of converting currency, of wiring funds, of all the various steps it takes to exchange currency. So if we go cashless, it eliminates a lot of those excess costs. Now, it's not good for people who don't have good broadband, obviously. And so it's potentially not good for the poor. It's not good for people who don't have bank accounts. It's not good for the elderly. And we could see an increase in consumer debt because when you don't have an idea of how much you're spending, you tend to spend more. And, what happens if your computer goes down where you can't access your money? So that's a potential problem too. And the final risk, of course, is cyber attacks. Again, if you're hacked, there goes your money and you don't have anything backing you up. Everybody seemed really excited about cryptocurrencies, and personally, I am not yet that excited about this topic because they have a lot of issues. And the biggest issue is that they don't really perform some of the basic functions of currency, which I've listed here. So they aren't a reliable store of value. Since cryptocurrencies are traded like a stock, they don't store value in the same way fiat currency does. Means of payment, well, not that many places take them yet, so that can be a challenge. And, you know, since they're not controlled by governments, how does the government can't use them at this point for monetary policy. So that's another big drawback. But again, those 4 functions are the basic functions of currency. We already talked a little bit about the UN, but just to remind you, the UN was founded in 1945 after World War II. And it grew out of the League of Nations. And really the UN is focused on, or at the time it was created, was really focused on preventing further conflicts on a global scale. We had just had World War I and then World War II, and we didn't want to do any of those things again. The UN started with 51 member states. There are now 193 of them. And in order to have your country really recognized as sovereign, it needs to be, or it should have external recognition by the UN. So again, the goal of the UN is not really to promote trade or anything like that. It's to work toward international peace, eliminating poverty, protecting human rights, developing the SDGs, and things like that. Oh, and by the way, the UN does not legislate, so the UN does not pass and enforce international law per se. We already mentioned the World Bank a little bit too, but you'll recall that the World Bank was set up, it's a Bretton Woods institution, and it was originally set up to help rebuild Europe. But it has now moved more toward reducing poverty. And, you know, it's interesting, the World Bank really makes grants, and it doesn't loan money much. If it does loan money, it's at very low interest rates, and it doesn't necessarily expect to be repaid. So the World Bank finances, you know, big infrastructure projects or dams or, you know, things that are going to contribute to the economic development of a least developed country. The IMF, you'll recall, also a BWI, was created when exchange rates were fixed. And so at the time, since countries couldn't devalue their currency in case of a problem, they could look to the IMF to lend them money to stabilize their currency. So now, however, the role of the IMF has morphed, and generally their role is to help lend to countries when they're having a financial crisis. They also provide an incredible amount of financial information and advice to countries who are having problems. So the World Trade Organization, which evolved from GATT, as we know, is at the heart of our multilateral trading system. So multilateral means that many countries are involved. You'll remember that we have bilateral agreements, which is us and one other country. We have regional trade agreements, which might be a group of countries like Europe or the USMCA, something like that. And then we have these large multinational organizations. And so the WTO, the founding principle was really to establish this multilateral trading system. The WTO promotes free and open trade. Now we know from this class that the idea of free trade is sort of a myth, but maybe we should say the WTO promotes freer trade. Another real key founding part of the WTO is that all WTO members must treat each other equally. So this is this most favored nation status idea that if you are a member of the WTO, you have the same rights as everybody else, and we need to trade fairly with everyone across the board. And if there are trade disputes, the WTO can help with that. The other requirement of the WTO is that your trade regulations must be transparent, and they must be predictable, and they must be clear and obviously published for everybody to understand. Here's a continuation of what I referenced on the WTO slide. We have these varying levels of trade agreements. Multilateral agreements are big trade agreements involving many nations. Bilateral agreements are just two countries, regional trade agreements. And we did talk about in class that regional trade agreements have become more popular and more complex, and I expect that that trend will continue after the whole coronavirus issue, where we'll be doing more regionally and perhaps less globally. We do also have plurilateral agreements. The TPP is an example where it's not necessarily regional. So the United States was in the TPP. Canada is in there, and they trade with some Asian nations. So it's not necessarily regional, but it's not on a global scale, so it's not multilateral. Our world is made up of this nation-state framework. So countries in general are also nation-states. And so nation-states have, as noted on this slide, a people, a territory with a border, and all these things have challenges, of course. So there's a people, there's a territory with a border around it, and there's sovereignty. So sovereignty means that there's a state, and that state has some kind of monopoly over violence. So that's control of the military and the police. The state has to be recognized by its own people, and they have to be recognized by other external states. So, the United States, for example, would have to recognize Catalan to be a separate state in order for it to actually be one. When we think about the blending of local culture and global culture, the first word that comes to mind, of course, is globalization. But we can also call that cultural hybridization. So cultural hybridization is exactly as stated on this slide. It's kind of a fusion of something local, of two different things that create a new and blended kind of culture. We see that a lot with food, we see that with music, and with other Culturally speaking, after the World Wars, we had basically a bipolar order. We had the United States and its allies. That was sort of one pole, and we had the Soviet Union and the states that it influenced, and that was the other pole. We moved from that bipolar order to a unipolar order where right now, or until maybe 10 years ago, the US really was the global dominant hegemon and really the only world superpower. So we moved from a bipolar order to a unipolar order. Now, however, we are moving from a unipolar order, where the US was the world's hegemon, to a multipolar order, where we've got China certainly especially with the coronavirus, China has a lot of soft power right now. It has a lot increasing amounts of influence. It's going to get its economy back on track probably faster. It's got a huge economy and a huge population. So certainly we see its influence. Russia is still kind of pushing toward having its influence. So we're moving from this unipolar order to a multipolar order where the US's hegemony is certainly being challenged or added to by these other rising world powers. And we certainly don't want to be considered one of those ugly Americans by being ethnocentric. If you're ethnocentric, you think that your way is the best way, and you're not open to the cultures and ideas of others. When you're polycentric, especially in a business setting, you consider best practices kind of from around the globe and have more of a sort of multipolar perspective. That's it for our review session. Good luck studying, and if you have any additional questions, don't hesitate to shoot me an email.